I think that a lot of us have noticed how loud a man becomes when he's still trying to convince the room of who he is. It's the overcompensation that he brings, the puff chest that he brings out, and the performative hustle that he puts on in front of others. It's that desperate need to be recognized and seen, and to be praised and validated, and, recognized as something strong, successful, admirable, or whatever the image of that day demands. However, then there is the other kind of man, the man which is quieter, maybe. They're less visible, and they're all these things, but they're still undeniably present in the room. They don't broadcast their work, they don't broadcast their worth, anything about themselves. Instead, they simply let the hustle do the talk. He doesn't compete for some sort of status or chase any sort of affirmations, because something inside that man clicked, and now he's playing a completely different game to absolutely everyone else in that room. That man is the most dangerous one. Not because he's violent in any form, or, he's not dangerous in a physical sense. Not because he's reckless, nothing like that. But instead because he's free. And a free man, a truly free man, is absolutely ungovernable. When you have absolutely nothing to prove to anybody, you stop performing. You stop running laps around somebody else's scoreboard. The applause doesn't just hit the same anymore, and the trophies just begin to gather dust. Instead, you start to ask bigger questions. And I like to think that these questions are not along the lines of what will they think of me, but instead of what will I think of myself as when nobody else is watching. That is when the real dangerous man comes out. That's when the real danger actually starts. Once you actually stop proving, you start building towards something. When the energy isn't spent posturing up and pretending, it's rerouted towards something else, something more productive, towards mastery, towards some sort of meaning, and the kind of focus that can only come when you're not constantly fragmented by some sort of insecurity. Most people will never, ever arrive there. Most men will die simply due to approval. They're addicted to that comparison and they always have a need to be seen winning because they don't believe that they are something unless somebody else validates them and says it to them. That is why they're not dangerous. That's why they don't create. That's why they don't have value. Because you can manipulate someone who still needs your validation. You can own someone who still fears being unseen. However, a man who's beyond all that and he's moved past this fallacy, he has already paid that price. And now, instead of being, cheaper to buy, he is unpurchasable. There is no negotiation for any price for him. Friedrich Nietzsche would call this man the man who has walked through the desert. It's the one who looked into the abyss and never flinched. Instead, it's not because he didn't feel some sort of fear, but instead because he chose not to be ruled by the fear. That is the single thing that kills that need to prove yourself to anyone. It's not some sort of arrogance, it's not pride. Instead, it's confrontation with yourself and with your demons. It's with that mirror at 3 a.m. or waking up at 5 a.m. and telling yourself, wow, I really want to go back to sleep right now. It's when all the games have stopped and all the fallacies have sunk and everything has left other than you and your own reflection. Now, a lot of people think that some sort of power is about dominance, but instead I like to think that it's not about climbing higher or shouting louder, but instead that real power comes from detachment. When you're not simply owned by the need to impress, you become impossible to be someone as predictable. You become unpredictable. You become centered and you become grounded, and you say less, but the things you say matter more. You move a lot slower, but every single step has a bigger weight to it. You don't chase things, instead you draw them and they attract towards you. There is a reason that a lot of people will feel unsettled around that kind of man, because he exposes how flimsy everybody else's persona actually is. He doesn't have to lift a finger to do that. It's just the fact that he exists and the fact that he is untethered that disrupts their realities. Stoicism talks about this concept a lot, and it's about indifference not as apathy but instead as an inner strength. It's the ability to remain unmoved by the highs and the lows of other people's opinions. I like to think that the highs and the lows don't matter if none of their opinions matter at all. Now, Seneca, I always fuck the pronunciation, but Seneca wrote that a man who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary. What he meant with that, I like to think, is that when you're living to prove, you're always suffering, because your worth is held hostage by that outside world. However, once you stop playing that metaphysical game, you genuinely reclaim your own peace. A man with nothing to prove doesn't process progress. He lives the progress. He lives the reality of that progress. He doesn't have to argue with anyone. Instead, he lets time as a factor vindicate the decisions that he makes. He doesn't need to burn himself out for some sort of approval. Instead, he endures the pain and he endures the burnout for meaning. That man, that kind of person builds things that last. And ironically, because he no longer needs the spotlight, people pay a lot closer attention to the things he says and when he speaks. However, never confuse this with giving up. It's not detachment out of defeat. Instead, it's detachment out of strength. It's the rejection of the exhausting, endless pageantry of needing to be enough for someone else. He's absolutely done with that life view. And now, every single bit of the energy that he used to put into that is instead reinvested into himself as a weapon. Now, I like to believe that the irony of the whole situation is that the man who finally stops trying to impress the entire world now becomes the man who the world starts to respect and is impressed by. That is the rational danger of the whole scenario. It's not the danger of destruction, but instead it's the danger of clarity, of purpose without any sort of noise, of peace without applause, of silence that speaks louder than any sort of performance. So if you're still stuck in that loop, and you're still trying to be liked and seen and envied by other people, understand the things that it is costing you every day. I like to think that those things are your time. No, I believe that those things are your time. They're your sanity. They're your creativity and your soul. You're giving up all those things, and that loop will never end. Because every time you meet one person's expectation, 5 other people show up saying you don't meet theirs. And the audience that you're performing for does not care. Instead, they move on. But you are left emptier every single time. So step off the stage and burn the costume. Let the crowd believe that you disappeared. Because you never actually did. All you did was leave the circus and found something better to build. When you have absolutely nothing left to prove, you stop living your life for other people. Instead, you start living like a man who remembers he was never put here to be admired. Instead, he was put here to become the thing he was born to become. And once you taste that, that free liberation of not being chained by other people's reactions to you, you will never ever want to hear that applause again.